Buckle up. We're going to take a deep dive into the Asus ROG Ally X. I have extensively tested the SD card on the Ally X. I haven't had one issue so far between my pre-production model as well as my production model. So that's at least 2 data points that the SD card seems to be working just fine. It's still a little bit too early to tell if this is completely fixed, but at least 2 data points that I have where I've used the SD card at length and it has been just fine. The next thing we must talk about before talking about specs or all the improvements on the Ally X, it is very difficult to actually properly benchmark the Ally and Ally X. If you're looking for a proper comparison, when we take a look at just setting performance mode, you can take a look at the power limits between the two of them. Even on the older Ally, on the newest Armory crate, the power limits are almost out of control. When you set the performance limit, it's supposed to be 15 watt, but for 3 minutes and change, it's running at 20 watt before it settles down at 15 watt. Likewise, on the Ally X, it stays at 24 watt for only about a minute and change, not 3 minutes and change, before it settles down to 17 watt. Now, that is the other part that you have to consider when benchmarking these two systems. The performance mode, the silent mode, and the turbo mode are completely different on these platforms. The silent profile on the Ally runs at 10 watt after some time, and on the Ally X, it runs at 13 watt. Likewise, for performance mode, it runs at 15 watt after time on the Ally and 17 watts on the Ally X. Effectively, what you're looking at is if someone just does the performance mode and accounts for the power limit differences, what you're going to see is a situation where if you're benchmarking a game like Batman Arkham Knight here, in the performance mode settings between those two, we see a sizable increase in performance between the Ally X and the Ally. Alternatively, if you had done what I had done and made the entire system 1-to-1 between both systems, you're going to see that 15 watt and 15 watt aren't that big of a difference in specifically this particular game and with the constraints that I have. Largely, that's what you're going to see. Generally speaking, performance increases are going to be between 5 and 10%, generally speaking for most games with the same settings between them. However, because we have more RAM and faster RAM, we can make benefit on the Ally X by pushing settings in a lot of different degrees, especially by going to like ultra quality in texture settings because we have enough VRAM to dedicate to it, and then having 16 gigs of system RAM for games that need it. And we're going to show you a few games that actually require having that RAM, especially when we set the VRAM to 4 gigabytes on the Ally itself, where we can really start noticing dips in our 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile, where that really starts impacting our frame pacing. Before we start getting to the objective numbers, let's first start talking about my methodology and how I have lined these machines up so that we have a better 1-to-1 relationship between them so that we have a more accurate comparison between them. For these particular systems, we have the latest Windows update that is available between both of these systems. All the firmwares and drivers are up to date and latest from Asus themselves as of July 15th, 2024. All AMD settings have been disabled. None of them are in effect on any one of the systems. For the Ally X, we are using the default 8 gigs of VRAM. On the Ally itself, I am using 4 gigs of VRAM. Memory core isolation is disabled on both of these systems, and the power profile that I'm using is the one that is from Asus itself. I am using the performance preset, which has an EPP of 60 mode. The clock limit was at 4 gigahertz. I have set this back to default. So this is the typical settings that we have for the performance settings. The only thing that I'm doing here is overriding the TDP setting of the performance profile so that I lock the power in PL1 and PL2 to the same value so that we don't have any differing power between them and we have a very accurate result. With my methodology out of the way, the system specs are largely the same. Both of these platforms are using AMD's Z1E. There are some considerations that we need to talk about because AMD has a separate driver set that does not follow their mainline Adrenalin driver set. This can cause problems if you're going to be using an eGPU. The Asus ROG Ally X now supports Thunderbolt, and if you use a Thunderbolt eGPU that uses AMD, you're gonna find yourself having some problems, and we'll detail that a little bit later in this video. The other 2 big differences on these handhelds is the ROG Ally X now accommodates a 2280 slot for the NVMe drive versus the 2230. So you can get a more economical solution that is readily available and cheap and good. So that's a nice improvement that the Ally X has as well. But the bigger improvement is that we have more and faster RAM. The Ally had 16 gigs of 6400 megatransfer RAM, and on the Ally X, we have 24 gigs of 7500 megatransfer RAM. When we take a look and benchmark the RAM, we can see that we're effectively getting a 17% performance increase on bandwidth, going between 78 gigabytes a second on the old Ally versus around 91 gigabytes a second on the new Ally X. How this check is done is it checks RAM in 128 megabyte chunks, testing the speed inside of those chunks. Now, taking a look at this graph, you can see that it ends at the same amount. The Ally X technically goes further because it has more RAM. In the video, you can see that we're still getting the same type of bandwidth between them. I'm just cutting it off just so it's a lot more consistent. And you can see a clean delineation so that you can see the performance improvement from the RAM itself. Let's move along to some synthetic benchmarks. We'll first look at CPU bound scenarios. We are using Heaven 720p and all low settings. This is going to really challenge the CPU at higher TDPs and across everything because we're really challenging the CPU to hit higher frame rates inside any given TDP scope. I am doing every TDP from 5 watt up to 28 watt multiple times on each platform. Even though this one page might look simple, it's actually a tremendous amount of benchmarks that happen to produce this particular graph. If we zoom in at the lower TDP end at 5 watt and 6 watt and 7 watt, we can actually see that the Ally is beating the Ally X in lower TDPs. Now you may be asking yourself, why is that the case? Effectively, what you have here is a tug of war between the three subsystems on the SoC, the package itself, trying to vie for power. On the Ally, we're running at 6400 megatransfers, which is 800 megahertz on LPDDR5X. That shares a clock domain with the memory controller that runs on the package, so that's running at 800 megahertz as well. On the Ally X, we're running at 937 megahertz, which again, that runs on the memory controller on the package. So at lower TDPs on the Ally X, the memory controller is trying to pull more power for itself, thus starving power to the CPU and the GPU. And what we're seeing is on the Ally, because it's only pulling for 800 megahertz or trying to satisfy 800 megahertz, we're actually seeing that there is a relief of power going to the CPU and GPU in this respect, so that the Ally can actually win out at these very low TDPs. And that is why on 5, 6, and 7 watt, we're actually seeing the older Ally outperform it ever so slightly, and it's all due to memory controller and the on-core power of the package itself. However, after that, when we start looking at it, everything is pretty much in line. When we get to 15 watt, this is where things get really interesting. We will notice that on CPU-bound scenarios that we're seeing a better performance improvement between the Ally and the Ally X. When we take a look at GPU-bound, that is not going to be as evident. When we look at the performance profile that Asus has set between the Ally and the Ally X, it really does favor the CPU a whole bunch, which is why we technically see a much better improvement on the CPU-bound side. As we push more power into 15 watt, pretty much watt for watt, we're seeing almost a clean 10% performance gain in CPU-bound scenarios. Even going up to 28 watt, we're seeing a much better gain, closer to 15%. So that's how things look from a zoomed out perspective, watt for watt on a CPU-bound scenario. Let's go ahead and take a look and see what GPU-bound looks like. When we take a look at the GPU-bound scenario, this tells a very different story. The power profile really does favor the CPU a whole bunch. We still see that the Ally is still winning early on, and this is, again, because of the memory. But after 7 watt, even 7 watt up to 20 watt, they're pretty much neck and neck. Again, these are hundreds of benchmarks that were aggregated to produce these results. And what we're looking at is effectively no real difference. Up until about 20 watt do we actually start seeing any particular difference in this particular test. And even from 20 watt to 28 watt, we're only looking at between a 5 and 8% increase in performance, a much smaller difference compared to the CPU-bound scenario, which again really speaks to how Asus manages their power profiles. Now, those were just averages at a per TDP look, so a very zoomed out look from averages. They do paint a really compelling picture between CPU-bound and GPU-bound scenarios. Specifically, when we think about it from modern PC games that are going to be very GPU-bound, how much is that increase in bandwidth going to help us? How much is the VRAM going to help us? Let's take a look at a bunch of different PC gaming benchmarks and see where we get the benefit from that extra RAM and see where we get a benefit from the extra bandwidth. Now that we're in the benchmark section of this review, we're going to be splitting up this review part of it into 10 and 15 watt TDP slices and then 20 and 25 watt TDP slices, just so it's a little bit faster to get through it. We're looking at Batman Arkham Knight. I'm using 720p and the max settings possible with no NVIDIA GameWorks. The reason why I always love showing this game is that it's a late-gen Unreal Engine 3 game that had a pretty crummy PC port. It did get a lot of patches to eventually get to a better state. There is a community patch that improves things further. This is just the vanilla build that comes from the latest latest version that is on Steam. So that's what we're taking a look at here. Why I like looking at it is that if we can look at this as an Unreal Engine 3 game, as a high-end, late-generation Unreal Engine 3 game for PC, largely you can look at this and get a good idea of what other Unreal Engine 3 games could generally get in the same vein. So when we take a look at 10 watt and 15 watt for the ROG Ally versus the ROG Ally X, at 10 watt, we're looking at 7% better on averages and 10% better on 1 percentile. This is actually a pretty good result for a GPU-bound situation. And when we take a look at 15 watt, it's basically lining up. Averages are 1%, 1 percentile is 4%. Effectively, this is meaningless. If we go back to the graph where we zoom out and can take a look at the GPU-bound synthetic part of it, we can see between 10 and 15 watt that our FPS pretty much aligns. There's no real clear winner here. And this is where I want to kind of get everything in line, is that how Asus does their power profiles, it still very much wants to feed the CPU first. Even though we're in an EPP 60 mode, it still has a propensity to want to push more power to the CPU. And this is also highlighted on the CPU-bound synthetic benches as well, because as we started pushing more power, that's when we started getting, 25% better performance inside that same TDP scope. Let's go ahead and take a look at 20 and 25 watt. Okay, so the ROG Ally at 20 watt and the Ally X at 20 watt, it kind of skips over here just so you kind of keep up. At our averages, we're looking at 2% better, and our 1 percentile, we're looking at 6% better. So that's something that is fairly okay in terms of 1 percentile improvement. When we go to 25 watt, we're looking at a 4% improvement and a 9% improvement on 1 percentile. This is generally what we're going to see in GPU-bound scenarios that do not have any memory constraints. We are not seeing any benefit from having 8 more gigs of RAM available to the system. We're 8 gigs of VRAM on the Ally X and then having 16 gigs for the system, where we're using 4 gigs of VRAM on the Ally and 12 gigs of system RAM. So what we're looking at here is there's no real benefit on this older game on Unreal Engine 3 where we have any memory contention. It kind of tracks linearly. The next game that we're going to be taking a look at, Cyberpunk, is a bit more interesting with regard to memory constraints, and we're going to be able to see much more improved 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile frame rate. The next game that we're going to be looking at is Cyberpunk 2077. I am using the Steam Deck preset. There is no upscaling whatsoever. It is running at 720p native. We're not upscaling to 720p. It's just native 720p. It looks really good. When we're looking at the 10 watt slices, you can see the Ally X is just under the Ally because of how they order the averages. When we take a look at our averages, the Ally is 2% better on averages. However, if we take a look at our 1 percentile, we can see that the Ally X is 28% better on our 1 percentile and 70% better on our 0.2 percentile. What this basically means to you is at 10 watt, even though this is not very playable, the frames are far more consistent inside of this TDP scope. It is not as herky and jerky. Moving along to the 15 watt, if we take a look at our averages, the Ally is 4% better. However, if we take a look at the 1 percentile, the Ally X is 15% better, and our 0.1 percentile is 70% better. Basically, this right here, you can see that the Ally X is a far, far smoother experience, and this is where that memory constraint part of it really starts to get involved. Now, you can minimize this by trying to just do low settings instead of the Steam Deck preset, but even given the Steam Deck preset in here, we can really start to highlight how having that extra 8 gigs of RAM and just isolating 8 gigabytes for it for VRAM, that there's less contention and there's a far more smooth, pronounced look. Let's take a look at 20 and 25 watt. So taking a look at the 20 watt TDP slice, our averages are now catching up. We're basically the same on averages. However, if we take a look at our 1 percentile, the Ally X is 7% better and our 0.1 percentile is 66% better. So again, you're really feeling that smoothness at these particular settings that are being played on this game. If we go to 25 watt, again, it is very evident that we still have this herky-jerkiness that's going from RAM constraints in these given settings. Our averages are 5% better on the Ally X. However, our 1 percentile is 12% better, 13% better, and our 0.1 percentile is 72% better. This is where we're getting the improvements from that extra RAM that is helping the Ally X a whole bunch. And this is probably a better example of a more smoother and consistent gameplay experience that is possible on the Ally X due to that bigger RAM. All right, the next game that we're going to be taking a look at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. I am running the DirectX 11 backend. This is one of the last DirectX 11 hard games that were available on PC before things started going to using resolution scaling inside of DirectX 11 games. This is a game that had no idea of resolution scaling at all. We're running at 720p in ultra settings. When we take a look at this, again, we're looking at a place where the added RAM isn't really a benefit between the Ally and the Ally X, and we're just getting whatever performance improvement that we can possibly get out of that bandwidth increase. Now, if we take a look at 10-watt TDP slice, we're looking at 4% better on averages on the X and 6% better on our 1 percentile. For 15-watt slice, it's basically the same, and even on the Ally, we're doing 5% better on our 1 percentile. More than likely, this is a margin of error, and this is just trivial amount of difference. And effectively, especially when we take a look at our GPU-bound synthetic benchmarks again, with how 10 and 15 watt are closely aligned, we're basically looking at no effective benefit between the Ally X and the Ally. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at our 20 watt and 25 watt slices. Now, just keep in mind that the Ally 20 watt is here, and the Ally X 20 watt is right here. When we take a look at our averages, we're looking at 6% better on a 20 watt slice, and our 1 percentile is 10% better. So this is where we're starting to see pretty much almost in line with how it looked on the GPU synthetic side. Is once we go up to 20 watt, we're starting to see an actual difference with that extra bandwidth that we're getting. And at 25 watt, we're looking at 8% better on averages and 8% better on 1 percentile. So pretty much this is a really good game to look at to get a clear understanding of, given Asus's power profile, very much like how Batman Arkham Knight was, where we're not seeing any benefit from the RAM side of things. It's not demanding too much from the system in terms of how much system RAM is needed, as well as VRAM. So this is once again a situation where we're seeing this particular game align with the synthetic benchmark that we saw for a GPU bound scenario. The next game we're going to be looking at is Horizon Zero Dawn. We're running 720p with no upscaling and using the Favor Performance preset. When comparing 10 watt between the Ally and the Ally X, we're looking at an 11% performance improvement on averages, a 62% performance improvement on our 1 percentile. Looking at the 15 watt slice, the Ally X averages are basically the same. However, our 1 percentile is 15% better and our 0.1 percentile is 61% better. Again, this is where we're seeing that extra RAM really smoothing out the entire experience so that there's no hitches, especially with the 4GB VRAM setting that I have on the Ally. Moving right along, going into our Ally side of things, if we take a look at our 20 watt TDP slice, we're looking at 4% better on averages and 8%, 7% better on 1 percentile. However, our 0.1 percentile, 77% better. Again, that consistency in terms of how the frame rate feels is going to be far better in this particular configuration that we have set up. Likewise, for 25 watt, we're looking at 9% better on averages, 12% better on our 1 percentile, and our 0.1 percentile is 85% better. So again, when we think about the whiplash between like older PC games and more modern PC games, we can clearly see the division with how much system RAM is needed for a game to run outside of just VRAM considerations. The next game we're looking at is Metro Exodus. The preset that I'm using is high settings and it is running at 720p. The 4A engine is quite demanding. And when we take a look at our 10 watt TDP slice, it is completely not playable, but our averages are 4% better on the Ally X and effectively the same on 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile. If we take a look at the averages for 15 watt, we're looking at 4% better on averages and 3% better on 1 percentile. Our 0.2 percentile is a little bit 4% lower on the Ally X. Effectively, what we're looking at here is something that is going to be pretty much 1-to-1 here. We're not looking at something that is largely all that much better in this particular scope. Let's take a look at 20 and 25 watt. If we go over to 25 watt, we do see a little bit of a difference. We're looking at 8% better on averages and 8%, 9% better on 1 percentile. Effectively, what we're looking at here is the difference between the Ally and the Ally X with the configurations that I set them on in high settings. There is no difference whatsoever. You really are going to want to push these things to be more CPU bound to get a clear difference. And the last game that we're going to be taking a look at in these benchmarks is Returnal. Returnal is a game that I love running because it is outrageously demanding on the GPU side of things. When looking at the differences for 10 watt, we're looking at a 20% increase between the Ally and the Ally X and a 40% increase on our 1 percentile. This is a pretty large swing here. When we take a look at 15 watt, it's not as exaggerated. We're looking at a 4% increase on averages. However, a nice modest 13% increase on 1 percentile. Largely, this is still not very playable. We do need to push significantly more power into the system to get better results. So let's take a look at 20 and 25 watt. All right, so looking at the 20 watt slice, we can see that the Ally at 20 watt is here and the Ally X at 20 watt is right here. Our averages are 5% better on the Ally X and 11% better, 12% better on our 1 percentile. Moving up to 25 watt, we're looking at 5% better on averages and around 9% better on 1 percentile. So basically that's what we're looking at in terms of performance improvements when we lock these machines one-to-one, having the exact same EPP. Everything is exactly set the same. The only difference is that we have 4 gigs of VRAM on the Ally and 8 gigs of VRAM on the Ally X. So we only have that RAM contention whenever that is present. When we see that, we can see it pretty bad on 1 percentile and 0.1 percentile, meaning that it's going to feel quite jerky when you're playing it. You're going to see a lot of spiking. So this is a improvement in those types of games where you need it, but otherwise, when we are in GPU bound situations, we're not really getting all of that bandwidth increase that we're getting from going from 6400 MT to 7500 MT, which is a 17% performance improvement. We're seeing it here in Returnal, but we weren't seeing it very much in any other situation. So that's what we're looking at in terms of just actual performance improvements when we line these up one-to-one. However, keep in mind that the Ally X is a more efficient system. It technically uses less power than the Ally does. One thing that I would really love to communicate to Asus is if they could manage, at least insofar as in the Armory Crate, if they could give the user all of the tools necessary to finesse power profiles exactly how a user wants it so that we can manage EPP, manage memory isolation, manage a bunch of Windows settings so that all of this can happen inside of Armory Crate itself without a user having to muck around and try to do things all over the place. I am still of the belief that if we push EPP to a higher number, say EPP 100, we could better inform the system to use less of the CPU and give more power to the GPU. Specifically, AMD has this problem as it is. Take this indie game for example. We're running Celeste here. I have the performance mode running, and it's just happily spinning its wheels, wasting power. Now, Asus in the Armory Crate software does allow you to quickly hotkey CPU boost. So if you just go ahead and toggle CPU boost off, you can see that we massively reduce how much power is being used, but got no difference in frame rate whatsoever. Now you may be asking yourself, why doesn't the system automatically cater power depending on if it satisfies a frame rate? And unfortunately, you're going to find many cases where that just doesn't happen correctly. So we have to take steps into our own hands. And thankfully, Asus does provide us the tools so that we can kind of tweak things, but this is something that we're still going to find ourselves that we shouldn't be tweaking those things. So a thing that I would ask Asus is that if they could really give us every available configuration possible, even inside of Windows' own configuration, to maximize how much we can customize power profiles outside of what they're doing. Because right now, the silent mode and the performance mode run at EPP 60. I would rather that be at EPP 100, and the turbo mode runs at EPP 0, which is frankly useless for a handheld and is only good if you're going to be running an eGPU. And since we're talking about eGPUs, let's dive quickly into a quick video that I made where I connect the Asus ROG Ally X to an external GPU running AMD's 7600M XT and see the problems that occur when you use an AMD eGPU on an AMD Z1E. Okay, so here we can see the Ally X, and I am using Thunderbolt so that we can get the AMD Radeon RX 7600M XT here. However, since I've now loaded the drivers for the 7600M XT, it is no longer compatible with the Z1E. So if I go ahead and disconnect this Thunderbolt cable, I have to reinstall the drivers for the iGPU on here. Now, it is possible to swap the drivers with an external tool that you can create yourself so that it can go from the official AMD Radeon drivers for an external AMD GPU, like I'm running the 7600M XT right now, and then convert to the Z1E driver when you go back to the handheld state. However, that's a bunch of mucking around, and every time a driver update happens, you have to update that yourself. It's just really messy and not something that I really recommend that you do. So ultimately, my point here is if you were going to plan on using an eGPU via Thunderbolt for the Ally X, What you really should be doing is getting an NVIDIA eGPU, because the drivers won't interfere with the iGPU drivers that is on the Ally X. This is not an Asus problem, this is an AMD problem. You can see we're getting 100-ish FPS right now, but I am running at 1440p, which is a more ideal resolution for the 7600 MXT. Very quickly, it is worth noting that it is using FSR upscaling to 1440p, so we are running at a sub-resolution of 1440p. However, you can take a look at my package power over on the top left-hand side for you. It's at 32 watts. We're going to be mainlining at like around 30 watt as our baseline. You can see I am in turbo mode right now, and what's good about turbo mode on Asus is that it does EPP mode 0, meaning that all of the power, all 31 watts of that power right now for the APU, it's really going to be pushing as much power to the CPU as possible because we have the eGPU here and it's powered separately. So that's just a quick look that eGPU solutions do work via Thunderbolt here, though again, I really would recommend you only use NVIDIA if you wanted to go this route. And this is what it looks like when we take out that Thunderbolt AMD eGPU. The iGPU no longer has a valid driver, so now I have to go and reinstall that. I want to leave off on this review on a high note, so we're going to leave the battery test for last. The one thing that I do want to mention as one of the improvements that Asus has done on the Ally X is improving the DPAD. The DPAD is a big improvement over the original Ally, but that isn't a tall mark to hit. The original Ally's DPAD wasn't fantastic, and insofar as DPADs go, you can see almost the pedigree that the Asus ROG Ally X is borrowing from, the old Sega Saturn type of D-pad, where it looks fairly similar in the same regards, but is far smaller in proportion. Additionally, while the D-pad on the Ally X is much better, overall, if I were to give it a grade, I would give it a B grade, not even B+. I have used much better D-pads. It's not bad by any means, and it is quite serviceable. It's just that tactility-wise, it is not as responsive as I would like it insofar as tactility and feedback in feeling which direction I've pressed in. There is a less pronounced feeling, especially compared to other membrane-based D-pads. So there is still a lot of improvements that Asus could do on a D-pad. I personally would love if they went to a dome-based D-pad like the PS Vita, and this is something that if you've been following me for a while, you know that this is something that I always ask for. Even the Xbox Series X has a dome-based D-pad. So even looking at the Xbox Series X D-pad is something that I would like Asus to go forward with, as that is a far simpler thing to communicate to engineers that I want something like that. Membrane-based D-pads are hard to make. They are not easy. 8BitDo is one of the few companies that always hits home runs on those. Ambernic has been doing much better as of late, but still where I find the D-pad on the ROG Ally X is an improvement, but overall I'd give it a B ranking. For the analog sticks, I never really had a problem with the analog sticks on the original Ally. I would say that there is a definitive improvement on the Ally X. There is a more concavity to the center divot on the analog sticks themselves, so it feels like a more pronounced spot for your thumbs to rest. Overall, I am a big fan of it. Additionally, the outside covering, that textured feel, is pronounced and is something that I ultimately prefer. Although I wouldn't say that the original Ally's analog sticks were bad by any measure, and the Ally X's analog sticks are just a small refinement, but still a welcome refinement. The other thing worth mentioning is that Asus has made it so that it is very easy to swap out these analog sticks. Both the mechanism itself, if you wanted to have something like from Gillikit where you can have a hole-based sensor, or if you just wanted to change the top itself, you can actually unscrew the analog stick from the inside and 3D print your own if you don't like what's on there. So there's lots of solutions that Asus has provided here, and they are all welcome additions. The last thing that we're going to be talking about in this review is the battery benchmarks. And this is something that I am exceedingly happy with Asus and what they've done here. When looking at a low TDP setting, which effectively would be the silent mode on the Ally, it would be a little bit lower on the Ally X, which would run at 13 watt, but I'm forcing it at 10 watt for both of these. When we look at a 10 watt TDP scope, on the original Ally, we got somewhere a little bit north of 2 hours of battery life. On the Ally X, we're getting 5 hours, so more than double the battery life on this, despite only having double the watt hours. And the reason that we see that is that the Ally X uses less total system power than the Ally does. The Ally X is more efficient than the Ally, despite having the same screen and the same SoC, the total system of the Ally X uses less total system power. Thus, what we're seeing is more effective battery life than just double. So a little bit over 2 hours and change, we're getting 5 hours and change, more than double the battery life inside of a 10-watt TDP scope. This is an excellent showing, and it's the same thing, even better at higher wattages. For this particular test, I started the Ally X at 80% because what I'm trying to demonstrate here is more the fact that what we're looking at is the difference in total system power and how much more power the Ally is using over the Ally X. Even though we can clearly see the TDP is pretty much locked at 25 watt consistently between the Ally and the Ally X, effectively what we're seeing is at the higher TDP range that the Ally is using consistently 2 more watts over the Ally X using the same TDP. That is huge. Even though I started the Ally X at 85% of its battery, I still got twice the battery life over the Ally. That is huge. We have effectively the Ally and the Ally X just double the battery life, but the Ally X is getting more than double the battery life in every scenario. This is absolutely huge and goes to show all of the refinements that Asus has done on the Asus ROG Ally X versus the Ally, where the Ally X quite literally is the super Ally. And that's really what I want to hammer home here. The Ally X is a super Ally. It has the same really good native landscape VRR display. It has the same still good Z1E chip for a handheld. And what's nice about that is Asus still only has one support avenue for both of those. They can still service both their Ally customers and their Ally X customers without having to worry about anything. Now, to answer your question, should you get an Ally X? If you already have an Ally, the question that I would ask you is, do you get battery anxiety when you're using the Ally? If the answer is yes, then yes, I can very much recommend the Ally X. I have not had any particular battery anxiety at all when using the Ally X, especially because I've been tuning the system like crazy. And if we take a look at my example for running Celeste, you're going to get 9.5 hours of battery life when just disabling CPU boost and playing older games. So you are very easily going to be getting 10 hours of battery life without sweating it. And the weight increase from the Ally to the Ally X really isn't that big of a deal. So if you were worried about battery anxiety on the original Ally, yeah, 100%, it's easy to recommend. If you were kind of hesitant and saying, you know what, I like everything they're doing, but now that I've seen all the benchmarks and stuff, the performance that I get out of the Ally wasn't all that great. It wasn't what I was looking for. And if I know that I'm going to basically get the same thing, that's not going to be something that I really want. I want to wait for the Ally 2. That's also something that you should consider. Where we are right now with the current wave of chipsets, we just need more GPU. We need smaller CPU and way more GPU. And AMD still is not really giving us that. They are just rebadging their CPU-bound, compute-heavy chips, and gaming is a happy afterthought. Until AMD makes proper gaming handheld chips, we don't have a good springboard to go to. So the current landscape of what's available to us, this is the best that we have right now. So if you wanted to wait, I totally get it. However, I applaud Asus for doing what I've been asking for a long time. When we take a look at the new and improved fans, how much less power is being used by the total system, despite the fact that they have the same display and the same chipset, and you line these up and we're using less power on the Ally X, it is absolutely incredible what Asus has done here, and they deserve a lot of credit. So thank you very much to the engineering team at Asus for just banging this one out of the park. I am super excited for the next iteration of what you guys are going to be capable of doing, because you've set a pretty high bar. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.